I'd like to talk about the thorny problem of war, especially in the context of what we call forever wars. We seem to have seen a lot of these lately, these wars that just go on and on and on. And so we ask ourselves, is there any way to get out of these situations or stop forever wars or take perhaps a different approach? Not an easy subject, obviously a controversial one, many sides, but just to raise some questions and some thoughts about it so we can continue this important dialogue about our time and the idea of what we can do in our own way to be peacemakers. And the Lord says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God." So we are called to be peacemakers, but certainly not easy in our day and time. One of the issues that is raised about forever war is the concentration of our own country and, of course, several other countries on the Persian Gulf area. And the idea is this a good thing, a necessary thing, an important thing? And there are, of course, many sides to this issue. This comes from January 1980, so we're talking over 40 years ago, from the President Jimmy Carter in his State of the Union address. He said, "The Persian Gulf is vital to the United States, and an assault on the Persian Gulf will be repelled by military force." This position became known as the Carter Doctrine and became a foundation of our policy toward the Persian Gulf. It was not really all that new in some respects. It certainly was kind of an unwritten policy, but President Carter was the first one to articulate it, and of course he articulated it because of the importance of oil for our economy and for the economies of the other industrialized nations of the world. So if there's no free flow of oil, if that is halted in some way, certainly economies will be greatly affected. Workers will be thrown out of jobs, people won't have supplies that they need, and all sorts of bad things obviously would happen if that oil was not available. So this became really a centerpiece of our foreign policy, an important objective to achieve, and you can see the rationale behind it. There were two assumptions to this policy. First was that the American way of life depended on ensuring unfettered access to the Persian Gulf oil. So, as I indicated, if that flow were stopped, what would be the impacts? It could be a disastrous situation for our economy, for ourselves going forward. So, this was a very important principle, and most people agreed with it, thought it was obvious, thought it was important. So that was the first assumption, the necessity of oil for our economy. The second assumption was the best way to ensure this is by military power. Again, you look at that assumption and you say, well, there's a certain logic to it. If we don't put force behind it, if we don't use our military might to ensure it, bad things could happen and we could be slow in our response. We're not able to respond in an adequate way to the situation. So it seemed kind of logical that, well, the only way to ensure this is by military power. But we have to look at it and say, well, those are two assumptions. Are they right? Are they wrong? And maybe from time to time, can we evaluate them, reflect on them, and see, is this correct? The thought was that there were other outside forces that could impact this as well. And at the time, of course, it was the Soviet Union, certainly a very strong power, and of course still is today in many respects. And the thought of, well, maybe they could move into the Persian Gulf, they could take the oil, take control of that, and that could, wreak havoc on other economies, obviously. Also, other outside forces were Iraq, and Iraq, of course, was in the region, but the government of Iraq run by a dictator, that could be a problem. And now, of course, the main problem that we look at is Iran. And, that particular country, what it could do in terms of oil production, what it could do in terms of the Persian Gulf, shipping, all of that raises some serious issues for us, certainly. The American strategy towards this has been, of course, constantly evolving in terms of, well, what military weapons, what military might is needed. The latest thinking has unveiled what they call Task Force 59, which is the use of unmanned aerial systems, unmanned sea vessels, and unmanned underwater vehicles. And the idea of the unmanned vehicles is that you're not putting any human life at risk. And so these unmanned vehicles could maybe do this job well, controlled remotely, very sophisticated technology. Maybe this could be done, and this could be a good thing, a positive thing. Certainly would impact us in terms of having to have people deployed there, which of course has all sorts of problems, and also the expensive allocations that are needed to maintain people in theater there. So those are some of the developments. Now let's look at, from Carter, how that has progressed. We certainly see what we call now the Bush Doctrine from the Carter Doctrine. Bush Doctrine was the importance of regime change. We have to change some of those regimes that are hostile to the country and put in new regimes. And we tried that certainly in Iraq, to a certain extent in Afghanistan, and also another part of the Bush Doctrine was counterinsurgency. So where there is an insurgency in these areas, developing a counterinsurgency, which would put troops in there to, establish bulkheads against these other insurgents, limit the insurgents in some way, and hopefully at some point defeat the insurgents who are there. And we saw the limits, certainly, of the Bush Doctrine. We saw the regime change was very difficult, and counterinsurgency, the difficulty there, of course, is maintaining it over a long period of time. You can be successful for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, but then insurgents come back, and you need a rather long commitment to that. We saw the problems with that in Iraq. We certainly saw the problems with that in Afghanistan. Staying there, 20 years, and then how long would you have to stay to sustain the counterinsurgency? Would you have to stay 50 years, 100 years, 200? It's becomes mind-boggling in terms of commitment of time, resources, and money in some of these areas, because those who are insurgents can move to another area. Then when you move to that area, they go to another. So it's, and they know the territory. It's their home base. And it becomes difficult. And of course, the question is always raised, well, how long will a foreign country like the United States stay in this area and sustain this effort? We can play a waiting game, wait them out, attack them here and there, make them uncomfortable, but eventually they will leave. And we've seen this, of course, in Vietnam, same thing. You can keep troops there for so long, but how long can you sustain that? Difficult to do. And then the same thing with Afghanistan. Then we had a development of that. We saw the limits of the Bush Doctrine, so we got into the Obama Doctrine. And the Obama Doctrine basically was two facets: airstrikes, the importance of unmanned drones and using the Air Force to strike the targets, less combat, where you have this person-to-person combat, more remote stuff. They thought that was better in terms of, obviously, there are going to be less casualties in that type of situation. But again, you have the collateral damage, you have civilian casualties, you have all sorts of problems connected with that. Then the second part of the Obama Doctrine was special ops, special operations, go in and do these surgical special operations. So the question that is raised is, well, what about the Carter Doctrine? Does this doctrine still hold? Is this area still vital for the United States of America? Must we keep a very sophisticated presence there, large number of troops, ships, and all of that, air bases? Is that important for us? Well, people raise, well, two questions about that. First is, well, there's been increased oil production in the United States with the development of new technology. Our oil production has increased. And so is it necessary for us to, have as much emphasis as we used to have on it? Certainly some emphasis would be necessary, but how much? And then also the question is raised, well, shouldn't we be using less oil and less fossil fuels because of global warming? So shouldn't we move in another direction, and we have to do this kind of rapidly, to decrease global warming? And if we take global warming seriously, and again, some do and some don't, some say global warming is a fiction, others say it's clear, it's obvious. So again, there's that debate about global warming. But given the thesis that we take it seriously and it is significant, then we certainly want to use less oil, yet less fossil fuels, move in that direction. How rapidly we can move in that direction, of course, is controversial. Can we do it in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Can we do it in a way that will be important for us to decrease the carbon dioxide in our air and to make our air healthier, and also to decrease global warming? So all of these things are questions that we have, but certainly if we look at those two issues, increased production of U.S. oil and then our effort to use less oil and less fossil fuels, it would indicate, to a certain degree at least, that the Carter Doctrine and the importance of the Persian Gulf is certainly lessened than it is in 1980. Maybe not completely, out in terms of, thinking about it, but certainly is it at the same level of significance? We can certainly debate that issue. And we look at that area and we certainly look at the people and we want to encourage, goodness in the people. We want to encourage good government. We want to help the people in whatever way we can. But is the military route the way to take in that pursuit? The key thing is certainly to use our resources, which are limited, wisely. One of the criticisms of the forever wars, the wars against terror, the wars against Afghanistan, all of these wars that seem to be, engulfing us and never ending, is, well, what about our limited resources? How do we use them wisely? What are the true threats that we face as a country, and what can we do to move forward? Now, how does this relate to us theologically? Well, theologically, there are certainly three concepts that would be important to consider in terms of this debate about forever war and how to be better peacemakers, and a better path for peace. Certainly, the first point is contrition, the necessary for contrition. So when we have executed a policy and it has failed, it has not worked well, it has caused more harm than good, certainly contrition is in order. The importance of being contrite, of recognizing that we have done something wrong and embracing a different path. The second element theologically that we have to look at, in addition to contrition, acknowledgement of sorrow, and acknowledgement of wrong, would be a sincere commitment to make restitution. So if we have done harm to a country, if we have done harm to a people, in terms of this collateral damage issue, certainly we have an obligation, don't we, to make restitution, to make those people whole, to in some way make up for the evil that we have caused them, the harm, the suffering that we have caused. But certainly that would seem to be an important theological principle that we would embrace. And certainly when we approach the sacrament of reconciliation, one of the issues that we face is, what can I do to repair that damage? So if I have had a remark that has hurt somebody, certainly I want to do something in a positive way to build that person up. If I have taken money from someone, restitution would be in order. If I have harmed a country by polluting the country, by damaging its infrastructure, by harming its citizens in some way, I have an obligation, certainly, to make restitution. And the third element is, theologically, we would say, is to sin no more. So to avoid the sin. So if we have been sinning in our public policy, in our public area, we certainly want to take a look at that and say, well, gee, that was wrong. We want to avoid that in the future. We don't want to sin anymore. And some would say, in terms of the new technology that we've developed, all these unmanned vehicles, both these aerial vehicles, these underwater vehicles, maybe there's a better use for that technology than in terms of war. Maybe one of those areas that many have suggested is in the Amazon River Basin. Deploying that technology, for example, to fight deforestation. And in the fight against deforestation, what are you doing? You're decreasing global warming. So it's not that the new technology is necessarily a bad technology. It can be used for good and peaceful purposes. So those are some thoughts about the forever war, how it relates to our theology, and what we can do really to embrace the way of peace, the path of peace, and to follow, as our Lord tells us, that blessed are the peacemakers, for they are the children of God. God bless.